It's time for us to check back in with Granny Hite and the 9 brides and see what happens next. If you missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. Hub marched across the clearing and made his way up the long slope. Not even a playful bucket of birdshot rang after him. He was glad he'd called, glad he'd faced the issue. It could have come out worse. He was sorry, though, that the Hardys refused to forget old scores. A Hardy getting caught in a Trevitt bear trap hadn't shortened the list of Hardys made to look ridiculous, though that one had almost nailed him too. He found himself thinking, her pa put it up to her. Did she want me to marry her? Grab, what a squeak. He scaled the slope a trifle faster and darted over the crest as if a whole tribe of hardy women were after him. Bright-haired, scrawny, each wrapped in whatever came handy. For the next weeks, Hub Trevitt tramped his solitary way, spreading a trapper's table for the wild things, clover honey, frog eggs and skunk scent for the wily red fox, apple as well as carrot for the muskrat. He set drag poles for the bobcat. He boiled or smoked his traps, or bound them against human taint with aromatic hemlock withes. When gale slanted down, he holed up in the cabin and stretched skins. He had wood, grub, tobacco, and his own company, which had always been good. What more could a man ask? Toward January's end, he noticed a change in himself, but it was a mood that came with the prolonged storms. Muscles grew cramped from being cabin-bound. Tobacco became tasteless. Well, the hut had been used by a long line of wintering Trevitts and was stocked for idle hours. Hub took down some seasoned hickory that lay across the rafters. He whittled a set of chair rounds and back slats too. The latter he boiled and bent. From a chunk of white oak he rived out thin, strong splints and wove them to a seat frame. Down at the home place in Cat Track Hollow, there were more little straight-setting chairs like this than Trevitt bottoms to use them, and a few more were generally on sale at Toller's Mountain Store. When a spell of false warmth brought sap up into the maple trees, Hub took moments from his trap tendon to cut post from a 2-inch limb. He lopped them to a short pair and a long, and gave the long pair a bending so as to ease the sitter's back. Dry hickory rounds and slats driven into green maple hold forever without nails or glue. Soon after winter clumped down again, Hub had his chair all made, and even Uncle Tate, who was a master, would have approved the handiwork. But the false spring had done something to Hub as it had to the sugar trees. It left him glummin' and restless. He scowled at the chair he'd finished. He put it in one corner and in another, and he kicked it aside, dissatisfied. Finally, he climbed up and fished around in the rafters for 2 light slabs of walnut, fine and straight-grained. What was yeasting in his mind had never been there before, and it angered him, but he decided to give way to it. This was hard whittling, for the slabs were dry and tough with age, but they began to take shape. When out on his trap line, he pushed them from his mind, but at evening he lifted the pile of skins where he kept them hid, brought them forth, and fell to shaving and scraping. They became slender, pointed, curvy. Their dainty ounces of gray-brown wood grew sleek as a mink's fur under his rubbing. Every chair maker knows that hickory, oak, or maple will creep all over a puncheon floor, but walnut won't creep, and that makes it the onlyest material for runners to a rocking chair. Yet what in this trapper's hut did a 6'3" solitary male want of a chair that rocked? Might as well sit in a lady's lap. Oh well, soon as winter was done, he'd take it to the holler and give it to Granny Hite or Levacy Vasey or one of the old maid cornets. Yet to a womanless man it was a comfort just to spy that little chair when he came home from his long tramps. Seemed like it nodded when he touched it. He'd purely given it graceful balance. On this particular evening of late March, Hub came in and he halted. The little chair was drawn up with its toes pointed toward his stove. That's how he'd left it, the chair being too big for hiding, but it wore a knowing air, as if it could tell something, and indeed it could. On one side of it was his stool, on the other a basket. Hub snatched up the basket. It was crammed to the top with pecan roots, madder plants, alder roots, dyes, every one for pretty baskets such as this. He dashed out, ran for the thicket that hid the bear pit. This time the trap hadn't been disturbed, but that tangled ball of ripped-down honeysuckle vines had been gathered up and lugged away toward the ridge. He followed while there was light. It was an easy trail, marked by the chaff and litter of the vines. Honeysuckle strands are fine for baskets. On this side of Peckerwood, they grew 25 feet long. On the other side, like all else, they grew scrubby and knotty. So vines for basketry were what had brought Kedron poaching last December. He saw it now. That's what had led her to tumble into the pit. And she'd wanted those vines badly enough even to steal back for them a second time. But she needn't have poked into his cabin. She must have peeked first and spied the chair. Had it roused her laughter? Had she crazily judged him lonesome? Couldn't she tell he'd made it for one of the cornets, or for Aunt Effie Tidnanny, or for putting up to sell at Toller's store? By what right had she dashed to sneak in and try it, and draw up his stool beside it? Anger took Hub for this piece of hardy impudence. He ran back to the cabin, snatched up the dainty chair, bore it outside, and whirled it high, broke it across his chopping block, brought axe down on it for finisher, blade and head, smashed it to bits like the chaff of the honeysuckle, and stalked in and cooked supper. It was time, he realized. He was getting down off this mountain. Skins of woodland creatures were beginning to turn red anyhow, and fur yellow, sign that the trapping season was over. In the morning, he'd pull out for the holler. But this morning, a sagging in the legs hit him. A dolorous mood buckled his knees. It made him want to sit all day on the doorstep, soaking up the sun. It kept him there, watching the butterflies caper and cut like painted leaves on the soft air, watching squirrels spin about the tree trunks and pounce and grapple in whirling blur. He found himself yearning to plink a dulcimer, which was a cockeyed seizure if there ever was one, for he had neither the lap harp nor the art. He decided that what he needed was a bowl of Granny Orilla Trevitt's tonic tea, and he shambled in and brewed some, though the smell of the stuff forced his head aside, and even by holding nose he couldn't down it. No wonder Kedron had fought like a wildcat when he poured the mixture into her. The memory of her fists and flailing elbows stirred a tingle. He discovered with a surge that Orilla's fearful toddy wasn't what he honed for. What he craved was a wrestle, a fight, a grip and tug of bodies, equal matched and angry. Ob Hardy's big carcass would be just the thing, or the raw-boned strength of Jim Hardy, or the crouch and cunning and lynx-quick pouncing of Hake. After a man's been cabined up with himself for a winter, he needs a ruckus, and those were the three men of violence and sound, endurable hatred who'd give it. He'd pull his traps, pack his catch, set for the home farm tomorrow. Today he was spiling, pining, panting for a fight. He made off up the slope through the piney woods to the knobs and balds in the wide sky of Peckerwood and down the Hardy side. He felt good. He felt great. He'd grab those lunkish frames, he'd bend and sway and cave them and crunch and hurl them one by one, or three to the bunch, and Pa Hardy too, if the old un didn't light out like a scared shoat. It was time these fish-mouthed Hardys got their final comeuppance, and the old bile shaken, squoze and belted out of them. He'd show them a Trevitt still was master. Hub felt the leap and churn of power. He laughed. He shouted. He slanched down through the sand myrtle and button bush, mashing bluebell and violet, tromping trillium, hollering for pure joy, rolling a song, bellowing his purpose. Everything was quick with life. Everything was out of its hole, out of its log, pod, shell, stump, and burrow. seeking battle, seeking frolic, sniffing the spring. There it was across the clearing, the Hardy homestead. "I'm a-comin'!" Hub filled the cove with whoops, filled meadow and woods with taunts and dares, for that was the surest way of discouraging a bullet, of bringing the brothers out with only their brawn and fury. "I'll heave Ob Hardy into a wellspring, and Hake into a manure pile. I'll hang Jim on a fence. I'll make you think Bash Trivet himself's passed by again." He crossed the clearing, flung a heavy cobble at the door. Nobody appeared. Weren't they to home? He clomped about. That's when he saw the float of a skirt. It whipped behind the barn. Hub took after. Like the squirrels that launched themselves round tree trunks, round the barn he went, full tilt. Tripping twice, sprawling once, these Hardys left tools scattered wide and careless. Since he couldn't find a fight, he'd settle for a foot race. The fluttering cloth made across the cow pasture, skimmed a fence. He followed with man-sized strides. In the woods it vanished. He tracked it by twigs that swayed, by leaves that shook. He knew he was gaining. He'd wanted Ob, Jim, Hake. Since they'd razooed and Pa too, he'd deal with nimble Kedron. He'd rattle her till she yelled. He'd make her straight tell what she'd been up to, snooping in his cabin, moving his stool, leaving her gear like that. There she was, darting between the sycamores, fleeing across a glade, skipping over the hummocks of a pond, sending the frogs scooting flat out. But he could cross hummocks too. He had her now. He reached for that flying cloth. The crash took the breath plumb out of him. He floundered and tore at the sharp-fanged thing, but it was around his hips with a huge hug of fire. It was a hickory hoop with curved nails in it. He was in a barrel, a stone-weighted muskrat barrel. He and barrel went over, shoulders and head under muddy water. He struggled, but couldn't get his footing. His feet were caged in the barrel, his knees and thighs locked in it. Shove as he would, his arms went down into ooze. Something righted him, brought his head up into sunlight, and it was about time. He'd swallowed a lake. He heard shrieks of laughter. He couldn't get out, for the least lunge would send the barrel over again. He gawked through the mud and slime that glued his face. There she perched on her hummock, doubled over in glee, elbows to knees, hair swinging. She mocked. She hooted. Nothing pallid about those young cheeks now. They shone. "Chop me out! Get an axe!" pleaded Hub. She laughed, choked, gasped, laughed some more, until she simply ran out of breath, until she grew weak from screaming that a Hardy had caught a Trevet hard and fast in a barrel trap. But she kept him there and told him things that a Trevet had never thought to hear from a Hardy, things that she seemed to think were good for him, of how uppity the Trevets had always been because their side of the mountain had better soil and weather, and better game trails too, and they'd been mighty selfish with them, which had helped them to keep the Hardys poor and badly shod and armed. And badly mannered too, she granted it. But what could you expect of folks on land so mean it sprouted only a handful of tan bark, which her men were away with now, hauling to town on a slide? Her last winter's upsy-daisy end of that trivet pit trap had been simply one more trivet win and Hardy bottom whack, but now the score was evener. A Hardy had speared a Trevet, and here he was, like a bullfrog flapping in a blue crane's beak, and if he'd admit it, she'd help him. Otherwise, he could fight the barrel. She had work elsewhere. The nails bit into Hub. He couldn't kick loose or climb out, and he'd peeled the skins from too many creatures to want to shuck his own. He was beat. He hollered that he'd come to do battle with her kinfolk, but had found only her, Kedron, and she'd whooped him. "Say that again." He said it again. "I'll go fetch the axe," said Kedron. She soon returned with the axe. Balancing on a tussock, she split him out precisely. Staves and hoops fell away from his well-raked hips. The hollers had gone out of him, and the urge and hanker for combat. He said, "Well, guess I'll be going back up the mountain." The hollers had gone out of her, too. "Reckon you will." Something held him to the spot, and it wasn't the ooze of the tussock. It was the newness of the situation and one special oddity about it. He said, wondering greatly, "First time a Trevitt was ever really whooped by a Hardy. Funny thing is, I don't mind it." "I bet you sting," said Kedron, "from the nails." "I'm sorry." He peered at her. She meant it. She wasn't laughing, and she was pretty, though muddy and draggled as usual, with a brand new light dancing about her. You'd have to go to a pansy patch or a sunset or a flight of Canadian honkers to find anything half so pretty, and even then there'd be something missing, something that she had. A great big idea came to him. Maybe it had been there all along, so big he hadn't seen it. He wanted to tell her about it. His tongue stuck like a pair of feet in a barrel. He yanked at the wedged tongue and blurted, "I been making a rocking chair." She went still. "Guess you saw that chair." Hushed and frozen like, she waited. "Well, I busted it." Her mouth, her eyes stood open, but she didn't speak. Couldn't she see he wanted to tell her he'd make another rocking chair, prettier by far, but that his stool and her basket must always stay beside it? Wasn't she going to help at all? He grabbed her. "Kedron!" Her neck smelled good. Her hair, mud and all, smelled clean and fresh as goldenrod. They clung to each other as the hummock broke under them. They laughed, for this plunge made fine clinging. "Kedron, when can I talk to your pa and fight your brothers?" She pulled away. "I hear them now. I wish I was still hotted up for them, 'stead of all gentled down and soft-like. I'm not at my best," soothed Kedron. "They'll beat you silly, but it won't take long," she decided happily. "I'll start making a batch of Orilla's mender at once. Might as well work my hand in it." That's the end of that chapter. The next one is Granny Hite's glasses. The quilters were working on a pattern known as Tangled Garter. This was an involved design intended for no particular reason for Levesey-Vasey, and Granny Hite, besides doing her own corner, wanted to keep close eye on all the rest, but she had mislaid her specs. A wild search followed, everyone pitching in, and everything being lifted and put down until the house was in a great state. Granny began to wonder if the glasses had been sewn into the quilt, when at tea time, there they were, right in the middle of the cake she had baked. The discovery was made by Zelda Podlaski, a plump and happy mother of 7 who'd come to the Hollow 6 years before. Everybody went into gales at this business of the baked spectacles, except Zelda. She sat very quiet, turning the steel-mounted lenses over and over in her workday hands. Gently she polished them with her soft underskirt. When she glanced up at Granny, tears were in her eyes. "They are what you saw us with the day we came. Through these bits of glass, into all hearts, you looked." "Stuff and nonsense," scolded Granny. "I think," said Zelda, placing them carefully in Granny's hands, "it is time you tell us everything. Only lately do I understand, and I wish to hear." "Why, this is rubbish, Zelda," retorted Granny. "No." Zelda's eyes searched Granny's. "Everybody here, while we sew, tells something. Now it is your turn. You will do it. Please?" "All right, Zelda." Granny perceived that Zelda Podlaski had been one of them long enough by now to know the whole tale, and Zelda's lovely daughter Esther and her sister Anna, the widow. But first Granny put the glasses on. How bright and alive were these faces around her. Life had been so long, that she should have so many young friends, the circle always renewing itself. She forgot to inspect the tangled garter, but Zelda was right. Much had begun the day Granny bought these glasses, and a comfort they had been. Granny had stepped to the doorway of Toller's Mountain Store to test the new specs with a glance up the path, and there came the young man in the thick fur cap, though it was April, the old one with the curly wire beard, a shawl tight around his shoulders, the short-of-breath young mother with baubles at her ears, and the small ones, girls in long wool skirts like little old women, and boys with outlandish pants harness. Furriners. Who are they? Granny wanted to know. Poles, grunted Amos Toller. I can see that without specs, Amos. Anybody can tell they want fattening. That woman's going to have another baby. She needs pine honey and iron. Those children, puny arms and pinly legs. Where are sich folks from? Grodzic in Poland. They've wrote 3 letters there and sent 2 parcels. Something stirred in Granny Hite, something disturbing. Furriners were a rare sight in the holler, and these were farther off than the ocean even. Poland. The newcomers mounted to the store porch. It was early and the whittler's bench was empty. They entered, the youngsters keeping to their ma. She did the bargaining. They'd come for candles, salt, coffee, and a pound of nails. Amos already had a small book on file with their credits and debits. Cash money seldom passed in the mountain store. The young father, whose chin had red stubble with a slash across it like a rope burn or a lash welt, prowled among the factory-made axes and scythes, trying them for heft and swing and passing hand down their smooth white helves. The woman gazed hungrily at garden seeds in gay envelopes. The young ones, like sober little grandpas and grandmas, huddled and peered silently at the striped candy and ginger pop. Purchases made, the odd family left, the children still at their mother's skirts. Taxed, Granny. Amos Toller, however did they find Cat Track Holler? What brings them here? I dunno how they found us, Matty, but they did. Name's Pudlasky. If you ask why they're here, I think it's to get away from something. They footed from Marionboro with packs on their backs, the young pa pushing his old pa and the least ones in a wheelbarrow. Where are they laying head? In the Peeler shanty. The Peeler cabin, little more than a 2-room shed, had been falling down ever since the Peelers moved out, California bound, 6 years before. They've bought the place, enlarged Amos. He shied a misplaced rubber boot to a top shelf and thumped down the cover of the savory coffee bin. I warned them Cass Peeler couldn't make a go of it. She said she and her man were strong. She pulled a gold ring off of her hand for down payment. I've wrote the news to Cass. Reckon his wife, after all these years, will enjoy a ring. He added doubtfully, these oughtn't to be here. The holler doesn't take to outsiders. Granny rapped out the question that counted. Amos, are they honest? The woman put a brooch up for their first flower and sich. I didn't want it, but she liked it best that way. Her man's working part-time over at Coal Mountain. I hear he's right peart with a pick. Yes, Matty, they're honest. Granny went to call on the Pudlaskys the very day. Though it was a walk for her, she took a jug of dandelion wine, which is powerful for the liver, and a jar of butter. When she saw how many things the Pudlaskys lacked, she wished she had also brought pots and pans and bedding. All they had was what they stood in and what they'd toted on their backs. But the woman had the tumble-down shanty shining, even if it was bare. She used stiff, slow schoolbook English. Her name was Zelda. Color had found her cheeks, and she was real pretty, with her white skin, long dark lashes, large eyes, and thick braids wound around her head. Her hands were quick. She used them in talking. The older children weren't in sight, and the younger, who watched Granny without moving, were solemn little people. Don't they ever play? Marveled Granny. Don't they scream and get into mischief? They will. Zelda stroked the heads that pressed her gown. Her hands were rough. She lifted them with comic pain from breaking land with mattock. Stepan is out there now." She nodded toward the fields. "What do you eat?" Granny's eyes had been busy. She hated prying, but she had to know. "I see taters, but no grits." "Grits? Hominy! Land of Beulah, don't you know what grits are?" "We eat borscht," said Zelda. "Never heard tell of it. The soup of these." She caught up a handful of leaves. "It is very good." "Sorrel leaves and water? Walls of Jericho! No wonder the young'uns don't skip and prance and hair pull. They need red eatin' meat, and green salad, and milk. Look at those legs." Zelda spread her hands. "Soon we shall have the garlics, the cabbages. This land, with work, it gives so much. The peasants, already, you are so kind." "Peasants?" "Even faggots from the woods you let us take." "Faggots? You mean sticks and limbs? Land of Canaan, take the whole tree." "This country is so big, so friendly." Zelda's eyes shone. As Granny turned to leave, for she had her hens to feed. "Go in the best of health," murmured Zelda earnestly. A new way to say goodbye, decided Granny. In spite of her ankles, she soon called on the Podlaskis again. She brought seeds, bean, squash, turnip, hollyhocks, bachelor buttons, 4 o'clocks. More to the point, she had Amos Toller's 12-year-old grandson along, lugging pots and bed kivers and a basket of baby ducks. Kyle promptly noticed 10-year-old Esther and became awkward with girl shock, then excitedly boisterous. "Ducks!" Mama Zelda clapped her hands. "Soon shall be feathers." "You might make a patchwork to hold them," said Granny. "You've enough old scraps?" "Oh, yes." Zelda unrolled a treasured bundle of wools and linens, much washed. "This was my mother's waist. This was my Yodwiga's apron. This," her voice went flat, "was my little David's jacket and cap." "They're torn," observed Granny. "It's a caution how clothes fall apart these days. They're too good to be ripped for crazy quilts. The goods just needs bringing to with thread and needle." "Yes," said Zelda, tonelessly, re-rolling the stuff. A voice began to holler in the back-of-the-nose sing-song. It was the grandfather. He sat before the hearth, snugged in his shawl. His hands over the blaze were long and fine. "He was a goldsmith," remarked Zelda. "He thinks now of his shop. Such a place it was." The caterwaul continued. The scrunched figure rocked on his stump stool. It reminded Granny of the yearly sawdusty meetings in the Hemlock Tabernacle, with Elder Martin lining out hymns and sermons, and everybody groaning, twitching, leaping at nibble and gnaw of awful sin, and making tracts and hallelujahs for the mourner's bench. She brought up the main purpose of her visit. "You must feel free to join us at the church. We're new lights here mostly, but hard shells are welcome too." Zelda Podlaski went bolt still, then eased and laughed. She patted Granny's hand. "But here in our little house we hold our Sabbath, our prayers. The good Grandpa leads us." The shawled form rocked and wailed. All the sorrow of the world was in that sing-song, the like of which Granny never had heard before. A thought froze her to the marrow. "You're not Episcopal, are you?" Zelda blinked. Worse dismay struck Granny Hite. "You're not Popish?" There never had been a Popish worshiper in Cat Track Hollow, but these folks, being Furriners— "We have our own church," stated Zelda simply. Her eyes were steady, wary. So it was something outlandish, perceived Granny. She decided to leave the matter to Brother Martin when that circuit-riding man should appear. "Whatever you are, you'll get over it," she promised cheerily. "We have wonderful camp meetings each May. No heathen can stand up to them." "We had pogroms each May," stated Zelda. "Pogroms?" Granny wondered if those were some kind of early fruit, maybe little pomegranates ripening in spring like tart pie cherries. Might be that Zelda had brought some seeds of them with her from Grojek. If so, Zelda didn't offer any in swap for Granny's garden sass and flower seeds. Not that Granny expected payment. An altogether different notion struck her, a splendid ideal. I'm going to tell Grandsir Beckett to come over here and fotch your old un and take him fishing, hunting too. What he needs is a day off with the menfolk and a good drench of cider. Get him out of that shawl. Grandsir is awful old, but he's mighty spry. Some night soon, your grunting old grandpa will be out after a fat possum, follering the hounds and baying with the best of them. You must cook possum slow with sweet potatoes. Possum? What is possum? Land of Dan, you are foreign, cried Granny. She made 2 more visits, though the way was over the toe of Peckerwood Mountain, briery and slippery and lumpy. She had Kyle help fetch a lamp and 4 laying hens, and she showed Zelda Pudlasky how to cook the food of the countryside. She taught her to make bread of home-grated cornmeal, Johnny cake, baked before the hearth on a greased board, bumper breakfast of hominy grits with red gravy. Zelda, in turn, had tricks of her own. Cakes made in oil with chopped onions rolled in, yellow cookies that were stars with 6 points, and dry as chaff unrised pats called mozzoth. She outraged Granny by baking 1 loaf of good cornmeal with rye flour mixed into it, a rock-like loaf which only went down because it was smeared with chunk honey an inch deep. Steve Pudlasky and the wonderful nearby woods had come upon a bee gum, and the Pudlaskys just about rolled in honey. The children were learning to play. They rode sticks, they shoved and squabbled some, they had poppets, little dolls of shucks and cobs. Granny rejoiced to see it. But Granny's troublesome leg veins and a dropping in for a long visit by Poppy McLeese and all her young ones shut down on more tromps to the Pillar place for a time. We'll stop right there for today. Really interesting peek into, we got to hear how the story ended with Hub and Kedron, how they did get to come together there in love and overcome the feud between the Trevitts and the Hardys. And then also the wonderful story that Granny has started. We'll have to wait till next time to finish it. Really heartwarming and interesting to me, the way the author put this juxtaposition of the Furriners, we would say here, which is just any outsider. It don't have to be somebody from Poland. It can be somebody from New York, California, wherever. That's something common you'll hear. It just means somebody that's not from here. How he put that in that Granny's kind of wariness about her and kind of thinking you shouldn't be here, but then at the same time Granny reaching out to help her, to give her all the, from the ducks and the hens and the taking her the pots and the pans and the kivers and asking about the kids and all that. Really interesting. And I think really, I would say, as far as my experiences, even in today's world, really a similar thing happens. People in Appalachia can be very clannish, I would say, closed off. Doesn't mean they're mean to you, or it doesn't mean they're going to run you out of town or anything like that, but can be clannish. But they can also be very giving and very open. And I would say the key to that, I get a lot of comments on here. Some people will say, well, how do they welcome outsiders? Well, for one thing, Appalachia is a melting pot of people from all over the world. It's not just people like me that have been here for many generations. There's already people here, so it's not like it's a closed off place. There's lots of people. But I always say the same thing. Most folks welcome people as long as they don't come here and then try to change everything. So you can see Zelda, she wasn't trying to change anything. Granny was kind of trying to change her a little bit, but not too forcefully. But Zelda wasn't changing. She was just like, oh, you're so nice. The peasants have been so nice, and this beautiful, look, there's so much bounty in the woods, and we've already got this, and we've already got that. So she wasn't trying to change anything. So I'm sure that helped Granny's opinion. And plus, we already know from reading the book, Granny Hite had a real soft spot for all people. She was a really good person, and so she could see that family, the Pudlaskys, were in need, and she was going to set out to help them. Interesting the part about when Granny told her, oh, well, you'll get over that, talking about her religion, which is, of course, not nice at all. But Granny didn't say it in a way It's complicated, I know, but it's like she wasn't actually saying it like, I'm going to change your way of thinking. It was more like just being bossy, like, well, you'll get over that and then you'll see we're right and you'll come along with us. More of a humorous thing. And as the book goes on, you see clearly Granny didn't intend to do that, but that part did remind me of my own granny, who can be very bossy sometimes. Interesting in the Kedron and Hub that we found out, she wasn't trying to hunt, she wasn't trying to steal his trap line, she was just going after the honeysuckle. That honeysuckle's what she wanted, and then she fell into the pit. And then that she come back for it because she really needed it, and then she left him that other stuff in his cabin. I like that when she caught him in the barrel trap there, that she made him listen. She gave him the other point of view from the Hardy side, the Trevitt. He was a Trevitt, and he thought that he knew everything and had it all, you know. So the way it is often for us humans in life, we see our perspective and we think it's the only one. So I really love that she, while she had him hemmed up there in the barrel, she told him, you know, said, well, here's some things you need to think about. For one thing, your side of the mountain has way more resources than ours does, you know, and told him all those different things. So that's one reason you always come out ahead, is because you're better off, and you've got country to be better off. You've got better resources to make sure that you are better off. So I really love that part. And all of us, me especially, I mean, I always say me especially because I'm the least among anybody, but need to think about other people's perspective. It's hard for us humans to do. We always just think of our own perspective, but always good to look through the eyes of someone else about no matter what it is, whether you're in a feud like the Hardys and the Trevitts or something else. I wrote down several words in this one. I continue to just love the language. So, of course, he was talking about the chair creeping across the floor. That just meant it would, as you moved or as you sit in it, it might move, you know, it wouldn't stay steady, it wouldn't stay still. Onlyest, that's a word that's common here, onlyest. You know, he was the onlyest little boy there that didn't have a hat, or I was the onlyest one there. And they decided not to even have the play because I was the onlyest one that showed up. So I love that word. Dast, that was one of the ones. They used dast, which just means like dare. We would say dare. I don't hear dast, but I have heard it, especially from older people, but that's not a real common one. Now, wrestle, that one is real common still, which is really just wrestle. It's just a way of saying it. So when Paul was little, Pap would wrestle with him in the floor. Of course, not really, but just playing, scuffling around, roughhousing in the floor. Corey and Katie would wrestle with each other until somebody ended up getting hurt and crying. That's what they did. Ruckus, that's a great word. Once you hear ruckus, it immediately makes you think of the sound of a ruckus. It's a word that is very descriptive. Bellerin, another one. If somebody's bellerin, that one's common here too. You might say, well, he was a bellerin about what was wrong at work and I was tired of hearing it. Clomped, that was a good one. They clomped around the side of the barn. That's another descriptive one if you think about clomping. Razzoed, that was one I'm not familiar with. I need to look in my dictionaries and see if it's in there. Razzoed. And it was like took off, I guess is how he was using it. Heshed. That's another one that I hear. Even Matt says, hush up. I mean, like not telling me to hush up, but if he was telling somebody to be quiet, maybe when Corey and Katie was little, he might say, hush up and listen to me. So that's a good one. Furriners, that was the one that Granny was using to talk about the outsiders. Awful old. Something part in there I wrote down said it was awful old. We use awful like that a lot. It can be awful nice or awful bad. It works both ways, but just puts emphasis on whatever it is that you're describing, if it was the old or the nice. And then Grandsir, he was mighty spry. He was old, but he was mighty spry. So that one's common too. I hope I'm mighty spry when I'm Grandsir's age. I'd like to be one of those people that stay mighty spry. I know everybody doesn't. We don't know what lays before us as we age, but I'd love to be mighty spry. I've been very blessed to always be mighty spry, so I'm very, very thankful for that, but I hope that trend continues for me. And as always, I hope you'll leave a comment and tell me what jumped out at you from the reading today. What was your favorite part? Of course, got to come back next Friday, so we've got to see what happens now with Granny and the Podlaskis. You can see that you know, Zelda asked Granny to tell the story, so you can see there's something that she didn't know about the whole story. So there's more to come. It kind of gives you some foreshadowing, I guess, that there's something else, because what we've heard so far, Zelda would have just known about. You know, Zelda would have known, well, I know you thought we were strange because we were from another country and we didn't exactly understand you, and I also know you really helped me, Granny Hite, and you helped our family, and how wonderful you were. So there's more coming, so be sure to come back next Friday to hear more about the 9 brides and Granny Hite.